A girl sits on a low wooden stool in a one-room house in a hill town nobody important has ever visited. The town is called Nazareth. The girl is mending the seam of a garment, needle moving in small, even stitches, the kind of work you do without thinking about it, because your hands already know the pattern. The sun is low. Gold light comes through the doorway and lies across the floor like something poured out. And then the room fills with a light that has no source, no lamp, no window catches it. It is simply there, the way water is simply wet, and the girl looks up. You already know her name, Mary. But right now in this room she is not yet anyone's favorite Bible character. She is a teenager in an occupied province of the Roman Empire, and an angel has just told her that the child in her body will be called the Son of the Most High. And you know what she says back. Not a question about biology, though she asks one of those too. She says something stranger. She says, "Be it unto me according to thy word." Hold that thought. Because on the far side of the empire, in a rented room in the city of Corinth, a different scene is happening. A man named Paul is pacing. A scribe named Tertius sits with a pen, a lamp, and a stack of pages, writing down words as fast as Paul can speak them. Paul has never set foot in Rome. He is dictating a letter to a church he has never met, in a city ruled by a young emperor named Nero. And somewhere in the middle of that letter, Paul reaches for a word. A strange word. A word borrowed from Greek mythology, from Roman stage plays, from stories about gods who reshape human beings against their will. Paul writes, "Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And here is what almost nobody tells you about that sentence. The Greek word Paul chooses for transformed appears in only one other place in the entire New Testament. One other scene. 3 men are standing on a mountain. Their teacher is in front of them, and his face and his clothes begin to change into something they have never seen a human being become. We are going to get to that mountain. We are going to get to those 3 men, and what they saw, and why Paul reached all the way back to that moment to describe what happens inside your mind when you become a Christian. But not yet. Right now, you need to understand something that most sermons on this verse get quietly, completely backwards. This is not a verse about trying harder. This is not a verse about a 5-step plan for positive thinking. This is not a verse about willpower or discipline or waking up earlier and reading more. This is a verse about what happens to you when you stop trying to change yourself and let something outside of you do what you cannot do on your own. You have felt this before, even if you have never had words for it. You have tried to break a thought pattern through sheer force. You gritted your teeth. You made the resolution. You white-knuckled your way through it, and for a while it even seemed to work, until it didn't. Something in you kept slipping back to the old groove, the old shape, like water finding the same channel it always finds. And you have wondered quietly whether real change was even possible for someone like you. Paul wrote an answer to that exact question 2,000 years ago, and almost every English translation of it hides the one detail that unlocks the whole thing. Here's what most people miss. In the original Greek, the verb be transformed is not something you do. It is something done to you. It is written in what grammarians call the passive voice, and in the imperative mood, which is a strange combination, because it means Paul is commanding his readers to receive an action rather than perform one. Imagine being ordered to be lifted, rather than ordered to lift. That is closer to what is happening in this sentence than anything English usually captures. But it gets stranger, because this changes everything about how you have probably heard this verse taught. To understand why Paul reached for this word, and not some other, gentler word for change, you have to go back to the room in Corinth where Tertius is still writing, and you have to understand who Paul was writing to and what world they lived in. You have to meet a Jewish couple named Priscilla and Aquila, who had already been forced out of Rome once and had only just returned. You have to understand what it meant to receive a letter like this in a city under the shadow of Nero's palace. And you have to understand a Roman poet named Ovid. His book about gods forcing shape changes onto human beings against their will was famous enough that everyone in Rome, believer and pagan alike, would have recognized the very word Paul was borrowing. they would also have understood exactly what he was doing when he redefined it. This is not a story about a Greek word. This is not a story about a translation footnote. This is not a story about ancient grammar for its own sake. This is a story about whether you are capable of changing yourself, or whether the change you have been chasing your whole life was never meant to come from you at all. You need to understand the room Tertius is sitting in. It is not a studio. It is not a scriptorium with rows of scribes. It is a rented space in Corinth, sometime around the year 57, and Tertius is holding a reed pen, dipping it into ink made from soot and gum, writing on a sheet of papyrus stretched flat across a wooden board on his knees. His hand is cramping. Paul has been talking for a long time, and Paul does not talk in short sentences. You can imagine the ache building in Tertius's wrist, the way his fingers stiffen after the 100th line, and still he keeps writing, because what Paul is dictating is not a casual letter. It is the most complete explanation of the Christian gospel that will ever be put into one document, and Tertius is the only reason any of us can read it today. His name appears exactly once in the whole letter, tucked in almost as an afterthought. I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, salute you in the Lord. One line. That's all history gives him. A cramped hand, a borrowed room, and a sentence about a mind being transformed that would still be quoted 2,000 years later by someone whose name he could never have imagined. Think about what that actually meant. Paul is writing to a church he has never visited. He did not plant it. He did not baptize its members. He does not know most of their faces. And yet he is about to tell them the deepest things he knows about God, about sin, about mercy, and about what it means to be made new. They have never seen him in person. He trusts that the words themselves will carry weight even without his physical presence to back them up. That takes a strange kind of courage. Writing your most important convictions to strangers, hoping the words alone are enough to be believed. And two of those strangers had a story of their own long before this letter ever reached them. Their names were Priscilla and Aquila, husband and wife. Tent makers by trade, which meant leather and awls and calloused hands, and the kind of practical, unglamorous work that built the fabric tents Roman travelers slept under. You meet them first in the book of Acts, and then again here, in Paul's letter, greeted by name near the close. But by the time this letter reaches them, they've already been forced out of the very city Paul is writing to. Years earlier, the Roman historian Suetonius records that the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. The expulsion came after disturbances connected to a man named Chrestus. This was very likely a garbled reference to disputes over Christ himself that had broken out in the Jewish quarter of the city. Whatever the exact cause, Priscilla and Aquila were swept up in that expulsion, their home taken from them, their business uprooted. Their whole life in the capital of the empire ended by an imperial decree they had no say in. You can imagine what that kind of loss does to a person. Not a metaphorical loss, an actual one. Packing what you can carry. Leaving behind the house you built your marriage in. Walking out of a city under armed guard because an emperor decided your presence was inconvenient. That is grief, the kind that sits in your chest for years afterward, the kind that makes you flinch at loud footsteps behind you. And now, by the time Paul's letter arrives, Claudius is dead. Nero sits on the throne instead, and the expulsion has quietly lifted, and Priscilla and Aquila have returned to the very city that once threw them out. They are sitting, most likely, in a house church, listening to this letter being read aloud for the first time. They hear a stranger from across the empire write about mercy, about a body presented as a living sacrifice, and about a mind being renewed rather than conformed to the pattern of the world around it. Imagine hearing those words after everything you had already lost. Imagine what "be not conformed to this world" sounds like to two people who had already watched what this world's power could do to ordinary, faithful people with no defense against it. But there is a third story sitting underneath this letter, and it is the one that explains the actual word Paul reaches for, not the theology behind it, the word itself. Every literate person in Rome in the first century had at some point encountered a book called the Metamorphousthe, written by the poet Ovid roughly half a century before Paul picked up his pen. It was essentially ancient Rome's most famous collection of transformation stories. The gods turned humans into trees, into spiders, into rivers, and into stars, almost always by force, almost always against the human's will, and almost always as either punishment or divine whim. A woman named Daphne turned into a laurel tree to escape a god's pursuit. A man named Actaeon turned into a stag and torn apart by his own hunting dogs, because a goddess caught him staring at her while bathing. Transformation in the world Paul's readers lived in was something that happened to you, something imposed, something you had no say in, usually something violent, usually something that stripped away whatever made you human in the first place. And it is this exact word family that Paul reaches into. The Greek word he chooses, metamorphousthe, comes from that very root, the same root Ovid's title comes from. Paul's Roman readers would have heard this word and immediately thought of God's reshaping humans by force. But watch what Paul does with it. He takes a word soaked in stories of forced, punishing, often terrifying transformation, and he turns it towards something completely different. Not a God ripping your shape away from you in anger, not a punishment for a wrong look or a careless word. A transformation you are invited into. A transformation that comes not from a capricious deity, but from the mercy Paul has just spent 11 chapters describing. This is not a small literary choice. This is Paul taking the most loaded word in Roman popular imagination, a word associated with fear and divine cruelty, and filling it with hope instead. Pay attention to this because it matters for everything that comes next. The two words Paul places side by side in this one verse are doing completely different jobs. One describes something happening to you from the outside, pressing you into a mold, like clay forced against a pattern it did not choose. The other describes something happening from the inside, a change in your actual nature, not your outward appearance. Paul is speaking to a church full of people who have felt Rome's outside pressure their entire lives. They include displaced tent makers, a scribe with a cramped hand, and house churches meeting quietly under an emperor's watchful eye. And he tells them there is a difference between being shaped by force and being changed by mercy. You have felt both kinds of pressure in your own life. The pressure to conform, to fit whatever mold the people around you are holding up, whether that mold is a job, a family expectation, a culture, an image you feel you have to keep performing. And then, somewhere underneath that pressure, a quieter pull. Not toward performing better, toward becoming something genuinely different, from a source that isn't you. There's one more thing you need to see before we leave this word behind for a moment. Paul does not use this word only once in his letters. He uses it again, years later, writing to a different church, in a different city, in his second letter to Corinth. There he says that all believers, beholding the glory of the Lord as in a mirror, are being changed into that same image, from one degree of glory to another. Same word, same passive voice, same picture of a person not forcing their own shine, but reflecting a glory that is already shining on them, the way a mirror does not generate light but simply receives it and gives it back. Paul did not stumble onto this idea once and move on. He came back to it, years apart, in two different letters, to two different congregations, because it was not a passing metaphor for him. It was how he understood the entire Christian life. Now watch what happens next, because we still have not gotten to the mountain. Here's the pattern in one sentence before we keep going. Rome had a word for being pressed into shape from the outside, and Rome had a word for being changed into something new from the inside. Paul put both words in the same breath and told a church full of displaced tent makers and nervous house church believers that they did not have to keep letting the outside world press them into its mold. If this is opening something up for you, this is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to do. Hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Now stay with me, because the deepest part of this word is still ahead of us. Now we go where Paul's readers actually lived their daily lives, inside a philosophy that had already tried to solve the exact problem Paul is solving and had come up short. His name was Epictetus. Born a slave, crippled, likely by a master who broke his leg out of cruelty, He eventually gained his freedom and became one of the most respected Stoic teachers in the Roman world, active in this very era. And Stoicism, the philosophy Epictetus taught, was obsessed with one idea: self-mastery. Discipline your desires, train your reaction, control the one thing you can control, which is your own mind, through sheer relentless will. You have met people who live by this philosophy without ever knowing its name. Maybe you have tried to live by it yourself. Wake up earlier, read more, feel less. Master your emotions like a general commanding troops. Push down what hurts and call it strength. It is a compelling picture. It has produced genuinely disciplined people. And it has also quietly broken people who tried it for years and found that willpower has a ceiling. And when they hit that ceiling, they had nowhere left to go because their entire framework told them the only tool available was more effort. Paul knew this world well. He had likely encountered Stoic teachers in the marketplaces of Tarsus, his hometown, and later in Athens and Corinth. These were cities where Stoic philosophy was not an abstract idea, but a daily conversation held in the open air, in front of shops, between friends arguing over how a person ought to master their own mind. And instead of offering his readers a Christian version of that same self-mastery, dressed up in new language, he does something almost jarring. He tells them the opposite. Be transformed, not transform yourself through discipline, not master your mind through effort. Be transformed. The verb is passive. Paul is not handing his readers a new set of exercises for the will. He is telling them that the change they are looking for is not something they generate. It is something they receive. Stay with me, because this is where the grammar stops being a technical detail and starts being the whole point of the video. In Greek, verbs carry what is called voice. Active voice means the subject performs the action. I lift the stone. Passive voice means the subject receives the action. The stone is lifted. Paul's word, metamorphousthe, is passive, and it is also imperative, meaning it functions as a command. Put those two things together, and you get something genuinely strange in ordinary speech. A command to receive something, rather than a command to do something. It would be like ordering a group of soldiers be carried across the river, not swim across, not build a raft. Be carried. The action belongs to someone else. Their part is to stop resisting it. This is not a technicality invented by modern scholars trying to sound clever. Grammarians have recognized this passive imperative for centuries, and it changes the entire posture the verse asks of you. You are not being told to work yourself into a new kind of person through gritted teeth. You are being told to yield to a work already being done to you, just as Paul told the Roman believers earlier in this very letter to yield themselves to God. It is like yielding your weight to water that is already holding you up, rather than thrashing to stay afloat through your own effort. Right next to this word, Paul places its opposite, and you cannot understand one without the other. The word for conformed is systematized, built from the Greek word schema, the same root that gives English words like scheme and schematic. It describes an outward pattern, a shape imposed from without, like clay pressed into a mold that was never part of the clay's own nature. This is the word for pressure from outside. Rome's expectations, Nero's culture, the unspoken rules of whatever room you walk into that quietly tell you who you are allowed to be. Two words. One means shaped from outside by force into someone else's mold. The other means changed from inside by invitation into something genuinely new. Paul places them back to back so his readers cannot miss the choice in front of them. Keep being pressed into the world's mold, or be changed by something that starts underneath the surface. But underneath the surface of what, exactly? Paul tells us, the renewing of your new. Here's the part nobody tells you about this word. Nous does not simply mean brain or intellect, the way English speakers often assume. It is broader than that. It is the whole faculty of perceiving, judging, evaluating, and deciding what things mean. Your nous is not just what you know, it is how you see. It is the lens behind your eyes that decides whether a hard season looks like abandonment or like refining fire. It also decides whether a stranger's face looks like a threat or like someone made in God's image, and whether your own failures look like proof you are worthless, or like ground still being worked by a patient hand. And the word Paul uses for this renewal is not the ordinary Greek word for new, the one that simply means new in time, like a new coin fresh off the mint. Paul reaches for a rarer word, anakinosis, appearing only twice in the entire New Testament. This word means new in kind, not simply another one like the last one, but a different nature altogether. The way a caterpillar's body is not simply a newer version of what it was, but genuinely, structurally different. Anakinosis describes renovation at the level of nature, not replacement at the level of the calendar. Put it together, and you get something almost nobody preaches this way. You are not being told to think more positive thoughts. You are not being told to try harder to see the bright side. You are being told that the very faculty you use to interpret your entire existence is being remade into a different kind of nature, and that remaking is not something you perform. It is something done to you, the same way Paul described believers earlier, in this letter yielding themselves to God, rather than continuing to yield themselves to sin. You have tried, at some point in your life, to think your way into being a different person. New Year's resolutions, journaling, self-help books stacked on a nightstand, most of them unfinished. And you may have made some progress, because willpower is not nothing. But you have also likely hit the wall Epictetus's followers hit, a point where sheer effort ran out, and the old patterns crept back in anyway, quiet as water finding its old channel. Paul is telling you that wall is not a personal failure. It is the natural end of trying to do, through effort, what was only ever meant to be received. Before you climb any further, sit with this. That wall you keep hitting is not a life sentence. It is a signpost, pointing past itself, toward the only kind of change that was ever going to hold. 2,000 years ago, on a mountain no one can identify with certainty, 3 men followed their teacher up a slope, tired legs, thin air, the kind of climb that leaves you breathing harder than you expected. Their names were Peter, James, and John, fishermen, men with calloused hands and no formal education, the kind of men nobody in Jerusalem's religious establishment would have picked to witness the most important event since creation itself. And yet these are the 3 Jesus brings with him, away from the crowds, up into the thin, quiet air near the top of the mountain. And there, in front of them, without warning, Jesus changes. Matthew's account says his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Mark says his clothes became so bright, so dazzlingly white, that no launderer on earth could have bleached them like that. And the verb both writers use, the verb sitting right there in the original Greek text describing what happened to Jesus' face and his clothes, is the exact same verb Paul later uses in his letter to Rome. Metamorphousthe, same root, same family. The word for what happened on that mountain and the word Paul commands his readers toward are grammatically the same event. And this is where it gets remarkable. Peter, James, and John did not make this happen. They did not climb that mountain with a plan for transforming their teacher's appearance through effort, technique, or spiritual discipline. They were bystanders, witnesses. The transformation came from somewhere else entirely. A glory that had been there underneath the whole time, breaking through to the surface in a moment none of the 3 men could have engineered, no matter how hard they tried. And that is exactly the picture Paul hands his readers in Rome. You are not commanded to climb your own mountain and force your own face to shine through gritted effort. You are commanded to be transformed, the same way Jesus was transformed in front of 3 exhausted fishermen who did nothing but stand there and watch. The glory was never something Peter, James, or John produced. It came from within Jesus breaking outward, and all they could do was witness it and fall on their faces. This is not a small connection. Paul was a former Pharisee who knew the Hebrew Scriptures by heart and almost certainly knew the stories about Jesus circulating among the earliest believers. He reaches for this exact word, this exact grammatical shape, to describe what happens inside an ordinary person's mind when they come to Christ. He is telling the church in Rome that the same kind of transformation that happened to Jesus' face on that mountain is happening right now inside their minds. The church is full of displaced tent makers and nervous believers meeting quietly under Nero's watchful eye. Not a performance, not a technique, a glory breaking through from somewhere they did not manufacture. You have probably tried, at some point, to force change in your own life through raw effort alone. Maybe it was a habit you were desperate to break. A way of thinking about yourself that kept you awake at night, replaying old failures like a loop you could not switch off. You tried harder, you made the plan. You white-knuckled your way through week 1, maybe even week 2, holding on by sheer force of will, refusing to let the old pattern win. And then, at some point, exhaustion caught up with you, and the old thought pattern crept back in anyway, quiet as water finding its old channel, and you wondered if you were simply broken in a way that effort alone could never reach. Here's what Paul would tell you. Standing in that rented room in Corinth, still watching Tertius's cramped hand move across the page. You were never supposed to force that change through your own strength. The verb was never active. It was always passive. You were never commanded to transform yourself. You were commanded to stop resisting and let yourself be transformed. It is the same way Jesus' face and clothes changed in front of 3 men who did nothing to cause it. It is also the same way Priscilla and Aquila, after losing everything they had built in Rome, could either keep letting the empire press them into its mold or yield to a renewal in their nous. That renewal changed the way they saw, judged, and interpreted every single thing that had happened to them. This is not a story about willpower. This is not a story about discipline. This is not a story about trying harder than you tried yesterday. This is a story about a mind that cannot renew itself by force, being remade by a glory that was never yours to produce in the first place. You are not standing at the base of that mountain waiting for a miracle far away from you. If you have yielded your life to Christ, that same word, that same passive imperative, that same anakinosis is already active in you, not a metaphor, not a nice thought for a greeting card. It is a present, ongoing, and grammatically real event, happening in your nous, whether you feel it happening or not, and whether you can name the moment it started or not. It is happening even if you have spent years white-knuckling your way toward a change that was always meant to come from outside you. So what do you do with a word like this? Here is the first thing you need to walk away with. The verb Paul chose in Romans chapter 12 is passive. You are not commanded to transform yourself. You were never handed a self-improvement project with your name on it. You were handed an invitation to stop resisting a work that starts outside of you and moves in. Here is the second thing. That transformation does not happen in your calendar, your habits, or your willpower first. It happens in your nous, the way you see, the way you judge, the way you interpret everything that has ever happened to you. Renewal in kind, not renewal in time. Not a fresh start with the same old eyes. A genuinely new way of seeing, growing in you whether you can feel it on any given Tuesday or not. And here is the third thing, the one that should stay with you longest. The exact word used for what happened to Jesus' face and clothes on that mountain, in front of 3 exhausted fishermen who did nothing to cause it, is the same word Paul uses for you. Not a metaphor borrowed for effect. The same grammatical event is taking place. If you belong to Christ, that glory is already breaking through in you, the way it broke through on that mountain, whether you have ever had language for it before this moment or not. So here's the question I want you to sit with, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments below. Think about a moment in your life when you finally stopped white-knuckling it, stopped trying to force change through sheer will, and let something outside yourself do what you could never do on your own. What was that moment? Tell me below. You were never asked to climb the mountain and force your own face to shine. You were asked to stand there and let the glory that was never yours to produce breakthrough anyway.